The fluorescent lights of Dusty Creek Public Library hummed overhead as Sarah Mitchell carefully folded her teaching blazer and placed it inside her worn duffel bag. At 32, she had once commanded the respect of teenagers in advanced calculus classes, her clear voice cutting through adolescent chatter with equations that unlocked university scholarships. Now she whispered to avoid the night security guard discovering her makeshift bedroom between the biography and self-help sections. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Outside, September rain drummed against the tall windows, each drop a reminder that sleeping in her 12-year-old Honda Civic had become impossible. The car's heater had given up 2 weeks ago, around the same time her savings account hit zero. Sarah pressed her back against the cool metal shelving and opened her laptop, its battery indicator showing a dangerous 15% remaining. She had exactly 43 minutes before the device died, and with it, her connection to any possibility of employment. The job posting glowed on her screen like a lighthouse in a storm. Town Administrative Assistant, Records Management Specialist, Dusty Creek Municipal Office. The position required organizational skills, attention to detail, and experience with educational documentation. Sarah's fingers trembled as she read the requirements again. After 6 months of rejections, overqualifications, and whispered conversations that ended when she entered rooms, this felt like divine intervention wrapped in bureaucratic language. Her teaching career had ended on a Tuesday in March when she'd walked into Superintendent Hayes's office with a manila folder containing evidence that would destroy him. Bank statements, forged invoices, and communication records proving Richard Hayes had embezzled over $200,000 from the district's technology fund. Money meant for new computers and classroom equipment had instead financed his wife's luxury spa business and his son's private college tuition. Sarah had expected gratitude from the school board, perhaps even recognition for her integrity. Instead, she found herself escorted from campus by security, her personal items packed in cardboard boxes, her teaching certificate suspended pending investigation. Hayes had moved faster than she anticipated, spinning a narrative about an unstable teacher, making false accusations to cover her own performance issues. Within a week, her reputation had been destroyed with surgical precision. The laptop screen dimmed as the battery warning flashed red. Sarah typed furiously, crafting her application with the same care she had once used to explain complex mathematical concepts to struggling students. She highlighted her master's degree in education, her 5 years of experience managing student records, and her expertise in data organization. What she couldn't mention was sleeping in libraries or the fact that her current address was a post office box paid for with change scrounged from her car's cup holders. Behind her, footsteps echoed through the library's main corridor. Sarah held her breath, recognizing the measured pace of Harold, the elderly security guard who had been pretending not to notice her presence for the past 3 weeks. His kindness came in the form of willful blindness, allowing her to maintain the fiction that she was simply a dedicated researcher working late hours. The footsteps passed without stopping, and Sarah released the breath she'd been holding. She clicked submit on her application at 11:47 p.m., watching the confirmation screen appear with a mixture of hope and desperation that had become familiar companions. Tomorrow, she would check her email at the McDonald's across the street, using their free Wi-Fi to monitor responses while nursing a single coffee for as long as socially acceptable. As she prepared to close the laptop, a new email notification appeared. Sarah's heart jumped, then sank as she recognized the sender. Mrs. Rodriguez from the Homeless Services Office had been tracking her location through their previous correspondence, despite Sarah's attempts to maintain privacy about her situation. The email contained information about a new shelter opening across town, complete with intake procedures and a waiting list that stretched into November. Sarah deleted the email without reading the details. She had visited enough shelters to know the rules, the questions, and the looks of pity that followed her wherever she went. Each facility meant surrendering more dignity, more privacy, more of the person she had been when students called her Miss Mitchell and parents sought her advice during conference nights. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Miss Mitchell, it's Tommy Chin from your AP Calc class. Are you okay? I heard what happened." Sarah stared at the screen, remembering Tommy's shy smile and his struggles with derivatives. Until everything clicked during a late afternoon tutoring session. She had stayed after school for months, helping him prepare for the college entrance exams that represented his family's dreams wrapped in mathematical equations. She typed and deleted 3 different responses before settling on a simple reply. "I'm fine, Tommy. Focus on your studies. You're going to do amazing things." The lie tasted bitter, but she had learned that protecting her students' belief in fairness and justice was more important than her own comfort with truth. Sarah's phone alarm buzzed at 6 a.m., cutting through dreams of stable employment and warm meals. She had managed 3 hours of sleep pressed against the library's back wall, her blazer serving as a blanket and her backpack as a pillow. The morning ritual had become automatic. Fold her sleeping materials, visit the restroom to wash her face and brush her teeth, and exit through the emergency door that Tommy had shown her during one of their after-school sessions. The boy was waiting for her in the alley behind the library, his school backpack slung over one shoulder and dark circles under his eyes that matched her own. At 16, Tommy Chun carried the weight of being the first in his family with a real chance at college. But his parents' restaurant had closed 3 months ago, leaving the family in a rental situation that changed weekly. He had been sleeping in the school's janitor closet until Sarah discovered his situation during a late evening when she returned to collect forgotten papers. "Miss Mitchell," Tommy whispered, glancing around the empty alley. "I found something you need to see." He pulled out a crumpled newspaper clipping from his backpack, the paper wrinkled from being handled repeatedly. The headline read, "Local ranch owner seeks administrative help," and below it, a small advertisement that made Sarah's breath catch. Thunder Ridge Ranch requires experienced record keeper for cattle operation and business management. Must have education background and attention to detail. Competitive salary, housing provided. Contact Jake Reynolds. A phone number followed, along with an address 15 miles outside Dusty Creek. Sarah read the advertisement 3 times, her mind calculating possibilities and obstacles in equal measure. Ranch work was something she had never considered, her experience limited to suburban schools and air-conditioned classrooms. But housing provided meant a roof, walls, and privacy. It meant Tommy could have a safe place to study without fear of discovery by school authorities. How did you find this?
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She asked, noting the date on the newspaper was from 2 days ago. Tommy looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "I've been looking for job listings every day. For both of us. I know you applied for the town position, but Miss Mitchell, that Hayes guy has friends everywhere in local government. This ranch job might be different." The wisdom in his observation stung because it was accurate. Hayes's influence extended through every municipal office, every school board connection, and every social organization in Dusty Creek. A ranch operation outside town limits might represent the first opportunity in months that existed beyond his immediate reach. Sarah folded the newspaper clipping carefully and placed it in her blazer pocket. "Tommy, you need to go home. Your parents will be worried. They think I'm staying at my cousin's house," he admitted. "I told them he needed help with math homework. They don't know about the restaurant or the eviction notice or any of it. They're working double shifts at the packing plant, trying to save enough for first month's rent somewhere permanent." The casual way he revealed his family's crisis reminded Sarah why she had chosen teaching in the first place. Behind every student struggling with equations was a human story of dreams, fears, and circumstances beyond their control. Tommy's parents had sacrificed everything to give their son opportunities they never had, and now their world was crumbling around the very education they prized so highly. "We need to get you to school," Sarah said, checking her phone for the time. "And I need to make a phone call." They walked through Dusty Creek's early morning streets, past the diner where Sarah occasionally splurged on coffee and toast, past the municipal building where her application waited in some bureaucrat's inbox, past the high school where her empty classroom stood as evidence of how quickly a career could disappear. The September air carried hints of autumn, reminding Sarah that winter was approaching with its promise of harder choices and fewer options. At the corner of Main Street and Oak, Tommy stopped walking. "Miss Mitchell, if you get this ranch job, will you take me with you?" The question hung between them like morning fog, complicated and heavy with implications neither could fully articulate. Sarah looked at his earnest face, remembering the day she had chosen integrity over security, truth over comfort. She had made that choice for students like Tommy, believing that protecting education meant protecting the future. Now the future was asking her for protection in return. "Let's see if I get an interview first," she said gently. "One step at a time." But as she watched Tommy disappear into the stream of students entering Dusty Creek High, Sarah knew that her next phone call would determine more than just her own fate. The ranch job represented possibility not just for stable housing, but for creating a space where learning could happen again, where a brilliant teenager could prepare for college, without fear of discovery or displacement. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number from the newspaper clipping. After 3 rings, a deep voice answered with a simple "Reynolds." "Mr. Reynolds, this is Sarah Mitchell. I'm calling about your advertisement for a record keeper. I have a master's degree in education and 5 years of experience managing complex documentation systems. I was wondering if we could arrange an interview." There was a pause, followed by what sounded like papers shuffling. "Miss Mitchell, are you the teacher who got fired for whistleblowing against Hayes?" Sarah's heart sank. Even 15 miles outside town, her reputation had preceded her. "Yes, sir, I am." "Good," came the unexpected response. "Anyone willing to stand up to that snake has integrity worth respecting. Can you be here at 2 o'clock this afternoon? I've got cattle records going back 20 years, and there's such a mess I can't tell my assets from my expenses." Relief flooded through Sarah so suddenly she had to lean against a nearby building for support. "Yes, sir. I'll be there at 2 o'clock. Fair warning, Miss Mitchell. This is a working ranch, not a classroom. The work is hard, the hours are long, and we don't have much patience for city ways out here. But if you're half as organized as your teaching record suggests, you might be exactly what Thunder Ridge needs." The call ended, leaving Sarah standing on Main Street with something she hadn't felt in months: hope. Not the desperate hope of survival, but the kind of hope that comes with possibility, with the chance to rebuild rather than merely endure. She spent the rest of the morning in the McDonald's, using their Wi-Fi to research cattle ranch operations and record-keeping requirements. Between articles about inventory management and tax documentation, she drafted a mental plan for presenting her qualifications in terms of ranch operations rather than classroom management. Student records became livestock tracking, grade management became financial oversight, and parent communications became vendor relations. At noon, she used the McDonald's restroom to change into her interview outfit, the same blazer she had worn to every job interview for 6 months, a white blouse that had seen better days but remained professional, and black slacks that had required strategic safety pin repairs. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman who looked older than 32, with worry lines that hadn't existed a year ago and eyes that held too much knowledge about how quickly security could disappear. But beneath the fatigue and stress, Sarah Mitchell still carried the confidence that had made her an effective teacher. The same skills that had helped struggling students master complex concepts could surely help organize ranch records. The same attention to detail that had uncovered Hayes's embezzlement could bring order to 20 years of accumulated paperwork. Thunder Ridge Ranch sat 15 miles outside Dusty Creek, accessible by a gravel road that wound through rolling hills dotted with cattle. Sarah's Honda Civic protested the rough terrain, but held together long enough to deliver her to a cluster of buildings that looked like they had grown from the Texas soil itself. The main house was a 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and shutters that had been painted white sometime in the distant past. Behind it, a massive red barn dominated the landscape, surrounded by smaller outbuildings and endless miles of fencing. As Sarah parked near the house, the front door opened and a man emerged who seemed to fill the entire doorframe. Jake Reynolds stood at least 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders that spoke of physical labor and hands that looked capable of handling both cattle and complications with equal competence. His dark hair showed touches of gray at the temples, and his face carried the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from years spent outdoors under the Texas sun. But it was his eyes that caught Sarah's attention. Despite his intimidating size and obvious strength, Jake Reynolds had kind eyes. The same quality she had learned to recognize in students who acted tough but needed encouragement, who built walls around vulnerability that could only be dismantled with patience and understanding. Miss Mitchell, he said, extending a hand. That completely engulfed hers. Welcome to Thunder Ridge. I appreciate you making the drive out here. Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Reynolds. Your ranch is beautiful. Jake looked around the property with the critical eye of someone who saw both its potential and its problems. It's been in my family for 3 generations, but I'll be honest with you, the paperwork side of things isn't my strength. I can tell you everything about every head of cattle on this ranch, but ask me to find a tax document from 2 years ago, and we'll both be here until Christmas. He led her toward the house, and Sarah couldn't help but notice how he moved with the careful grace of someone accustomed to being larger than his surroundings. Everything about Jake Reynolds suggested strength held in check, power tempered by consideration for others. The ranch house interior reflected the same practical approach as its exterior. Comfortable furniture arranged for functionality rather than fashion, walls decorated with family photographs and rodeo awards, and everywhere the evidence of a life dedicated to honest work. But it was the office that made Sarah's breath catch. Papers covered every surface like an archaeological dig through decades of ranch operations. File cabinets stood open with documents spilling onto the floor, and the desk disappeared beneath layers of invoices, veterinary records, and correspondence that seemed to multiply exponentially the longer she looked. It was the kind of organizational disaster that would have terrified most people, but to Sarah, it represented opportunity. "This is where I need help," Jake said, his voice carrying embarrassment that made him seem more human despite his intimidating size. "My wife Emma used to handle all the record keeping, but she died 3 years ago, and I've been drowning ever since. The tax accountant threatened to fire me as a client if I don't get organized, and I'm pretty sure there are important documents buried in here that I haven't seen since the Clinton administration." Sarah walked into the office chaos, her trained eye already beginning to categorize and prioritize the scattered papers. She could see patterns in the mess, logical systems that had been abandoned rather than maintained. This wasn't the result of incompetence, but of grief overwhelming structure until even basic organization became impossible. "Mr. Reynolds, this looks overwhelming, but it's really just a matter of creating systems and sticking to them. I can see the bones of good record keeping here. It just needs someone to put everything back where it belongs and establish procedures to keep it that way." Jake watched her move through the office with growing amazement, as if she possessed some kind of magical ability to see order within chaos. "You really think you can fix this disaster?" Sarah turned to face him, drawing on the same confidence she had used to convince struggling students that calculus was conquerable with the right approach. "Mr. Reynolds, I've organized educational records for 500 students across 6 years of curriculum. I've tracked everything from graduation requirements to lunch money accounts. Cattle records and ranch finances are just different categories of the same basic challenge." For the first time since she had entered Thunder Ridge, Jake Reynolds smiled. It was a genuine expression that transformed his entire face, revealing the man he had been before grief and responsibility had settled on his shoulders like a permanent burden. "Miss Mitchell, when can you start?" Sarah's first morning at Thunder Ridge Ranch began at 5:30 a.m. with the sound of cattle lowing in the distance and the aroma of coffee drifting up from the kitchen below. For the first time in months, she woke in an actual bed rather than curled against library shelves or cramped in her car's front seat. The guest room Jake had assigned her was simple but clean, with handmade quilts that spoke of Emma Reynolds' touch and windows that framed endless Texas sky. She dressed quickly in clothes more suited to classroom than ranch work, but they would have to suffice until she could afford appropriate attire. Downstairs, she found Jake already seated at the kitchen table, wearing work clothes that emphasized his substantial frame and reading glasses that made him look more scholarly than his intimidating size suggested. He glanced up as she entered, offering a mug of coffee that steamed invitingly in the morning air. "Sleep okay? I know the place is quieter than town. Some folks find the silence unsettling." His voice carried genuine concern, the kind of consideration that suggested he understood what it meant to be displaced from familiar surroundings. "It was perfect," Sarah replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "I'd forgotten what actual quiet sounded like." Maria Santos bustled through the kitchen door carrying a basket of fresh eggs, her salt and pepper hair pulled back in a practical bun, and her weathered hands moving with the efficiency of decades spent managing ranch households. She was perhaps 55, with the kind of maternal presence that immediately made spaces feel warmer and more welcoming. "So you're the teacher Jake hired to wrangle his paperwork nightmare," Maria said, setting down the eggs and studying Sarah with frank curiosity. "Good luck to you, Mija. I've been after him for 3 years to get that office organized, but he's stubborn as his prize bull when it comes to asking for help." Jake's cheeks reddened slightly at Maria's commentary. Maria's been keeping this place running since before Emma died. She's got opinions about everything and isn't shy about sharing them. "Someone has to keep you from working yourself into an early grave," Maria retorted, beginning preparations for what appeared to be a substantial breakfast. "Besides, it'll be nice having another woman around here. This place has been too quiet for too long." As they ate breakfast, Jake outlined the ranch's basic operations with the methodical precision of someone who understood complex systems even if he couldn't organize their documentation. Thunder Ridge ran 2,000 head of cattle across 15,000 acres, managed seasonal breeding programs, maintained relationships with feed suppliers across 3 counties, and navigated federal regulations that changed with bewildering frequency. "The complexity is impressive," Sarah observed, making mental notes about the various record-keeping requirements. "How have you been managing without proper documentation systems?" Frank Garcia entered through the back door as if summoned by her question, removing his hat and nodding respectfully in Sarah's direction. The ranch foreman carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had earned his position through competence rather than politics, and his weathered face suggested decades of outdoor work under harsh conditions. "We've been managing by remembering everything," Frank said dryly. "Jake's got a mind like a steel trap for cattle breeding records. I keep track of equipment maintenance in my head, and Maria remembers every financial transaction since the Carter administration. But memories don't satisfy tax auditors or insurance investigators. That's why Miss Mitchell is here," Jake said, his tone carrying relief that suggested he'd been worried about this problem for some time. "She's going to create systems that don't depend on our collective memory." After breakfast, Jake led Sarah to the office that would become her primary battleground. In daylight, the chaos seemed even more overwhelming than it had during her interview. Documents covered every surface in layers that suggested sedimentary accumulation rather than intentional organization. File cabinets stood open like mouths, frozen mid-scream, their contents spilling onto floors already carpeted with decades of neglected paperwork. "Where do you want to start?" Jake asked, his voice carrying the helpless tone of someone who couldn't even imagine where to begin addressing such comprehensive disorder. Sarah walked slowly through the office, her experienced eye cataloging the various types of documents scattered throughout the space. She could identify veterinary records mixed with tax documents, breeding charts buried beneath equipment receipts, and correspondence that ranged from important legal notices to obvious junk mail. But beneath the chaos, she could see evidence of systems that had once functioned properly. "Your wife had excellent organizational instincts," she observed, picking up a file folder that showed Emma's careful handwriting. "These labels are logical and comprehensive. The system didn't fail because it was poorly designed. It failed because maintaining it became impossible after she was gone." Jake's expression softened with a mixture of grief and pride. "Emma could find any document in this office within 30 seconds. She said organization was just another form of caring for the people who depended on you." "She was right," Sarah replied gently. "Good record keeping is really about protecting the future by preserving the past. Everything in this room represents decisions and investments that affect Thunder Ridge's long-term success." She spent the next hour creating preliminary categories while Jake watched with growing amazement. Sarah moved through the chaos with the systematic approach she had once used to organize curriculum materials for multiple courses, creating stacks for different types of documents and identifying patterns that would inform her organizational strategy. "You're making this look manageable," Jake said, his voice carrying wonder that suggested he'd begun to believe the office disaster was beyond salvation. "It's not magic, just methodical thinking," Sarah replied, pausing in her sorting to meet his gaze. "The same skills that helped struggling students master algebra work for organizing ranch records. You just have to break overwhelming problems into smaller, manageable pieces." By lunchtime, Sarah had established basic categories and cleared enough space to create a functional work area. Frank joined them for the midday meal, bringing updates about a sick calf and questions about ordering replacement parts for aging equipment. As they discussed ranch operations over Maria's homemade tortillas and beef stew, Sarah began to understand the intricate web of relationships and dependencies that kept Thunder Ridge functioning. "Miss Mitchell," Frank said during a lull-in conversation, "Jake mentioned you used to teach high school. What made you want to work on a ranch?" The question hung in the air with deceptive casualness, but Sarah recognized the protective instinct behind it. Frank was assessing whether she could be trusted with Jake's vulnerability, whether her presence represented genuine help or potential complication for a man who had already endured enough loss. "I discovered that organizational skills transfer across different environments," she replied carefully. "And after what happened at the school, I needed to find work where integrity was valued rather than punished." Frank nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with her answer. Integrity is important in ranch work. Cattle don't care about politics, and weather doesn't negotiate. You either do the work honestly or you fail. That afternoon, Sarah dove deeper into the office chaos, uncovering documents that revealed the scope of Jake's struggles since Emma's death. Bank statements showed declining balances, overdue notices accumulated in concerning quantities, and correspondence from various agencies suggested that Thunder Ridge's problems extended beyond simple disorganization. Around 4 o'clock, Jake appeared in the doorway carrying 2 glasses of sweet tea and wearing an expression of barely contained anxiety. "Find anything interesting in all that mess?" Sarah accepted the tea gratefully before answering. "I'm finding a ranch operation that's been trying to function without proper financial oversight for 3 years. You're not in immediate danger, but some of these issues need attention sooner rather than later." She showed him a stack of correspondence from the state agriculture department regarding expired permits, overdue tax filings that carried mounting penalty fees, and insurance notices that suggested coverage lapses that could prove catastrophic if anything went wrong. "How bad is it?" Jake asked, his voice tight with the kind of controlled fear that came from knowing problems existed but being unable to quantify their scope. "Bad enough that ignoring it longer could cost you the ranch," Sarah replied honestly. "But not so bad that we can't fix it with proper organization and systematic attention. You're going to need to make some phone calls and probably pay some penalty fees, but Thunder Ridge isn't in imminent danger." Relief flooded Jake's features so completely that Sarah realized he'd been carrying fears much worse than the reality she'd uncovered. "I was starting to think I might lose everything Emma's family built here." "That's not going to happen," Sarah said with quiet conviction. "We're going to get these records organized, establish systems to keep them current, and make sure Thunder Ridge operates with the kind of professional documentation it deserves." As evening approached, Sarah found herself settling into rhythms that felt more natural than anything she'd experienced since leaving teaching. The methodical process of sorting and organizing documents engaged the same part of her mind that had once crafted lesson plans and tracked student progress. But there was something deeply satisfying about working with tangible results, seeing physical order emerge from chaos rather than hoping educational concepts would eventually manifest in student understanding. After dinner, she called Tommy from the ranch house phone, needing to check on his situation and update him about her new position. The boy answered on the first ring, his voice carrying relief that suggested he'd been worried about her silence. "Miss Mitchell, I was starting to think something had happened to you. How did the ranch interview go?" "Better than I hoped, Tommy. I got the job, and they're providing housing. I'm calling from Thunder Ridge Ranch right now." There was a pause before Tommy spoke again, his voice carefully controlled. "That's amazing news. I'm really happy for you." But Sarah heard the loneliness beneath his congratulations, the understanding that her success meant his support system had moved 15 miles further away from his daily reality. "Tommy, I want you to know that this doesn't change anything between us. If you need help with college applications or just someone to talk to, I'm still here." "I know, Miss Mitchell. It's just that things have gotten harder since you left town. Hayes has been asking students questions about you, trying to find people who might have helped you or supported your accusations against him. Some kids are scared to even mention your name." The information hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had known her whistleblowing would have consequences for herself, but she hadn't fully considered how Hayes might retaliate against students who had been associated with her. The thought of Tommy or other kids facing pressure because of her choices filled her with guilt and anger in equal measure. Tommy, you need to be careful. Don't mention our conversations to anyone at school, and if Hayes or anyone else asks about me, just say you haven't had any contact since I left. Promise me. I promise, Miss Mitchell. But it's not right. You were the best teacher at that school, and now they're acting like you're some kind of criminal. Sometimes doing the right thing has consequences we don't anticipate, Sarah said, her voice heavy with the weight of lessons she'd never wanted to learn. But that doesn't mean we stop doing right things. It just means we're more careful about how we do them. After ending the call, Sarah sat on the ranch house porch watching stars emerge in the vast Texas sky. The silence that had seemed so welcoming that morning now felt heavy with the isolation of her new circumstances. At Thunder Ridge, she was safe and employed, but she was also cut off from the students and community connections that had defined her identity for years. Jake emerged from the house, carrying 2 mugs of coffee, and settled into the chair beside her without asking permission. His presence was comfortable rather than intrusive, the kind of companionship that didn't require conversation to feel meaningful. Rough phone call, he asked after several minutes of shared silence. Just checking on one of my former students. A brilliant kid who's dealing with some difficult circumstances because of what happened to me at the school. Jake nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the horizon where lightning flickered in distant clouds. Guilt's a heavy burden to carry, especially when you're carrying it for doing something right. The simple observation carried weight that suggested personal experience with difficult choices and their unexpected consequences. Sarah glanced at his profile, noting the tension around his eyes that spoke of his own unresolved burdens. You sound like someone who understands that particular weight, she said gently. Emma died because I wasn't there when she needed me. Jake replied quietly. I was at a cattle auction in San Antonio, chasing a deal that would have improved our breeding program. She had car trouble on her way to town, pulled over on the shoulder of Highway 87, and called me for help. But I was in the middle of negotiations and told her to call Frank instead. Sarah waited, sensing that this story didn't end with mechanical repairs and successful rescue. Drunk driver hit her while she was waiting for help. Frank found her 20 minutes later, but it was already too late. If I'd dropped everything and gone to help her myself, if I'd put her safety ahead of business concerns, she'd still be alive. The raw pain in his voice made Sarah's chest tighten with empathy. She understood the particular agony of second-guessing. Choices that couldn't be changed, of carrying responsibility for outcomes that felt disproportionate to the decisions that caused them. You couldn't have known what would happen, she said softly. Making practical choices based on available information isn't the same as choosing to put someone in danger. Maybe not, but try explaining that to yourself at 3 in the morning. When you're lying in bed, remembering the irritation in your voice when the person you loved most needed your help. They sat in silence as the distant lightning grew closer, bringing with it the promise of rain that would be welcome after weeks of dry weather. Thunder rumbled across the landscape, a sound that seemed to emerge from the earth itself rather than the sky above. Sarah, Jake said, using her first name for the first time since she'd arrived at Thunder Ridge. I need you to know that hiring you wasn't just about getting the office organized. This place has been too quiet since Emma died, too focused on just surviving each day without thinking about building anything for the future. Having someone here who understands that work can be meaningful, that helping others matters more than protecting yourself, it makes this feel like a home again instead of just a place where I happen to live. His words carried vulnerability. That was all the more powerful for coming from someone whose physical presence dominated every space he entered. Sarah realized that Jake Reynolds, for all his size and strength, was as displaced from his former life as she was from hers. They were both people trying to rebuild identity and purpose after losses that had redefined everything they thought. They knew about themselves. Thank you for giving me a chance when no one else would, she replied, and for understanding that sometimes people need opportunity more than they need sympathy. The first raindrops began to fall as they moved inside, but Sarah felt something shifting in the atmosphere that had nothing to do with weather patterns. The formal politeness that had characterized their first day together was evolving into something more genuine, a recognition that they were both carrying burdens that might be easier to bear with companionship. As she prepared for bed that night, Sarah reflected on the unexpected turns her life had taken in just 24 hours. Yesterday, she had been a homeless teacher sleeping in library corners and applying for municipal jobs that might never materialize. Tonight, she was settling into a ranch house bedroom with meaningful work ahead of her and the beginning of connections that felt more authentic than any she'd experienced since losing her teaching position. But even as she felt grateful for her changed circumstances, Sarah couldn't shake the memory of Tommy's voice on the phone. The loneliness and fear that suggested her absence from Dusty Creek was creating its own complications for people she cared about. The distance that provided her safety might be exposing others to difficulties she hadn't anticipated. Outside her window, rain drummed against the glass with increasing intensity, washing the dust from ranch buildings and preparing the ground for whatever seeds would be planted when morning came. Sarah fell asleep to the sound of water falling on thirsty earth, dreaming of classrooms that transformed into vast spaces where learning happened under open sky rather than within institutional walls. She woke the next morning to find that the rain had stopped, leaving behind air that smelled clean and full of possibility. But when she checked her phone, there was a text message from Tommy that changed everything. "Miss Mitchell, Hayes knows where you are. He came to my family's restaurant last night asking questions about you and the ranch job. I think he's planning something. Be careful." Sarah stared at the message as her stomach dropped toward her feet. Somehow, Richard Hayes had discovered her location and was already taking steps to extend his influence beyond Dusty Creek's boundaries. The safety she had found at Thunder Ridge was about to be tested by forces she had hoped to escape, and Jake Reynolds was about to discover that hiring her had brought complications he never could have anticipated. The sound of boots on the front porch announced Jake's arrival for breakfast. But Sarah knew that this morning's conversation would be very different from yesterday's discussions about cattle records and organizational systems. The past she had tried to leave behind in Dusty Creek was following her to Thunder Ridge, and everyone she was beginning to care about was now potentially in its path. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and prepared to have one of the most difficult conversations of her life. Jake Reynolds deserved to know what kind of trouble his kindness might have invited into his world, and Sarah needed to discover whether the foundation of trust they had begun building could survive the weight of complete honesty about the enemies she had made and the risks they represented for anyone foolish enough to offer her sanctuary. Sarah found Jake in the kitchen, standing at the window with his coffee mug cradled in hands that seemed too large for the delicate ceramic. His shoulders carried the familiar tension of someone preparing for a day of physical labor, but there was something different in his posture this morning, a stillness that suggested deeper contemplation than usual. When he turned at the sound of her footsteps, his expression held the kind of careful attention that meant he had already sensed something important was coming. "Morning," he said simply, his voice carrying the measured tone he used when discussing serious ranch business. "You look like someone carrying heavy news." Sarah appreciated his directness, the way he cut through pleasantries to address what mattered. It was one of the qualities she had noticed about ranch life in general, this tendency to focus on substance rather than social nicety when circumstances demanded honesty. "Jake, I need to tell you something that might change how you feel about having me here." She pulled out her phone and showed him Tommy's text message, watching his expression carefully as he read the warning about Hayes's inquiries. Jake set down his coffee mug with deliberate precision, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts as he processed the information. When he finally spoke, his voice carried calm assessment rather than alarm. "Tell me about Richard Hayes. Not just what he did to your career, but who he is as a person and what kind of resources he has for making trouble." Sarah felt relief at his practical response, the absence of blame or regret that might have been justified given the complications she was bringing to his household. She settled into the chair across from him and began explaining Hayes's position in Dusty Creek's power structure, his connections throughout local government, and his demonstrated willingness to destroy anyone who threatened his interests. "He's not just corrupt," she explained. "He's systematic about protecting his corruption. When I exposed the embezzlement, I wasn't just threatening his financial schemes. I was challenging his entire network of relationships and mutual favors that keep him insulated from consequences." Jake listened without interruption, his attention focused with the same intensity he brought to evaluating cattle or assessing weather patterns. When she finished speaking, he was quiet for several minutes, his gaze fixed on something beyond the kitchen window that might have been the horizon or might have been possibilities she couldn't see. "Sarah, I need you to understand something about Thunder Ridge and about me," he said finally. "This ranch has been in my family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather built the original house with his own hands after coming here with nothing but determination and a willingness to work harder than anyone thought possible. My grandfather expanded the operation during the Depression when other ranches were failing. My father modernized everything and built relationships with buyers across 3 states." He paused, his expression growing more intense. "Emma and I were supposed to be the generation that passed it on to our children, that added our chapter to the family story. When she died, I thought maybe that story was ending with me. But having you here, seeing this place come back to life, with proper organization and forward thinking, it's reminded me that Thunder Ridge still has chapters left to write." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion at the quiet passion in his voice. The way he spoke about the ranch not as property, but as legacy, responsibility, and hope combined into something larger than individual ownership. "What I'm trying to tell you," Jake continued, "is that Hayes can threaten me all he wants, but he'll find that running off a schoolteacher and intimidating ranch operations are very different challenges. I've got resources he can't touch, relationships he can't influence, and stubbornness that makes his look like casual preference." Maria entered the kitchen at that moment, carrying fresh eggs and wearing an expression that suggested she had overheard enough of their conversation to understand its significance. She set the eggs on the counter and turned to face them both with the kind of maternal authority that transcended employment relationships. "Senor Jake, if there's trouble coming, Frank and I need to know about it. We've been protecting this ranch and this family for too many years to be kept in the dark when someone threatens either one." Jake nodded, recognizing the validity of her concern. Maria's right. If Hayes is planning something, everyone here needs to be prepared. "Sarah, would you be comfortable explaining the situation to Frank when he comes in for breakfast?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words, asking whether she was ready to trust the entire Thunder Ridge household with knowledge that could complicate their lives and potentially put them at risk. But looking at Maria's determined expression and remembering Frank's quiet dignity, Sarah realized that these people understood loyalty and protection in ways that transcended mere employment obligations. "Yes," she said simply. "They deserve to know what they might be dealing with." Frank arrived 20 minutes later, removing his hat and boots before entering the kitchen with the careful courtesy he showed toward Maria's domestic domain. His weathered face carried the alert expression of someone who had already sensed tension in the household's morning rhythms. "Something's got everyone wound tight this morning," he observed, accepting coffee from Maria with a nod of thanks. "Trouble coming?" Sarah explained Hayes's background and her current situation with the same straightforward approach she had used with Jake, appreciating Frank's minimal questions and thoughtful attention. When she finished, the ranch foreman sat quietly for several minutes, his calloused hands wrapped around his coffee mug as he considered implications and possibilities. "This Hayes fellow sounds like the kind of man who mistakes having influence for having power," Frank said eventually. "Those types usually fold when they run up against people who can't be bought or intimidated. Question is, what kind of trouble is he likely to bring, and how do we prepare for it?" The practical focus of Frank's response epitomized the ranch approach to problem-solving that Sarah was beginning to appreciate. Rather than dwelling on blame or regret, the conversation immediately moved toward assessment and preparation, treating Hayes's threat as another challenge to be managed rather than a crisis to be endured. He could target the ranch's permits, tax status, or regulatory compliance, Sarah suggested. Men like Hayes usually work through official channels because it gives their harassment legal cover. Jake's expression hardened with determination. "Then we make sure our documentation is perfect and our compliance is beyond question. Sarah, I'm going to need you to prioritize getting our records organized enough to withstand any kind of official scrutiny." "I can have the essential documents sorted and filed within a week," Sarah replied. "But Jake, there's something else you should know. Hayes doesn't just attack directly. He also goes after people's support systems, tries to isolate his targets by making it costly for others to help them. Frank leaned forward with interest. You mean he might try to pressure our suppliers, buyers, or business relationships? Exactly. And he's particularly vindictive toward anyone he sees as enabling his enemies. Hiring me might have painted a target on Thunder Ridge that goes beyond just harboring his former victim. The weight of this possibility settled over the kitchen like morning fog, heavy with implications none of them had fully considered when Jake made his offer of employment. Sarah felt the familiar guilt that had plagued her since leaving Dusty Creek, the knowledge that her choices continued to complicate life for people who were only trying to help her. But before the guilt could overwhelm her resolve, Jake spoke with quiet conviction that cut through her self-doubt. Sarah, Emma used to say that you judge people's character not by whether they create problems, but by how they handle the problems that come their way. Hayes created this situation with his corruption and vindictiveness. You're just dealing with the consequences of doing what was right. Don't confuse being his victim with being responsible for his actions. The wisdom in his words reminded Sarah why she had been drawn to teaching in the first place. This opportunity to help people navigate complex situations by understanding the difference between cause and consequence, between responsibility and guilt. Jake Reynolds possessed the kind of moral clarity that made difficult decisions seem manageable, not because they became easier, but because the right path became more visible. So what's our strategy? Maria asked, her tone suggesting that she had moved past any concern about whether to help Sarah and was now focused entirely on how to do it most effectively. We document everything, we prepare for scrutiny, and we make it clear to anyone who asks that Thunder Ridge Ranch stands behind its employees and doesn't cave to political pressure, Jake replied. And we make sure Sarah knows she's not facing this alone. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching the ranch house, an unusual occurrence during morning hours when most neighboring ranchers would be occupied with their own chores. Frank moved to the window and peered out toward the gravel drive, his expression shifting to alert concern. 2 cars, he reported. Official-looking plates, but not county sheriff. Could be state agriculture department or tax assessors. Jake's jaw tightened with the kind of controlled tension that preceded confrontation. Faster than I expected, but not surprising. Sarah, do you recognize either of the vehicles? Sarah joined Frank at the window, studying the approaching cars with growing unease. Both vehicles had the generic appearance of government transportation, but their timing suggested purpose rather than routine inspection. I don't recognize the cars, but the timing is too convenient to be coincidental, she said. Hayes has connections throughout state government. He could have triggered an inspection or audit within hours of learning about my employment here. The cars stopped near the main house, and 4 individuals emerged with the kind of professional efficiency that characterized regulatory visits. 2 appeared to be inspectors carrying official clipboards and cameras, while the other 2 had the bearing of supervisors or investigators. All 4 wore expressions of bureaucratic determination that suggested this was not a social call. Mr. Reynolds? The lead inspector approached the porch where Jake now stood, his imposing frame filling the doorway. I'm Inspector Davidson from the Texas Department of Agriculture. We're here to conduct a routine compliance inspection of your cattle operation. Routine inspections are usually scheduled in advance, Jake replied evenly, and they typically happen during spring or fall roundup when cattle handling is already scheduled. Davidson consulted his clipboard with exaggerated attention to detail. This is a special audit triggered by concerns about record-keeping irregularities and potential violations of livestock tracking requirements. We'll need to examine your documentation, inspect your facilities, and interview key personnel. Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she recognized the language Davidson was using, the carefully neutral phrasing that characterized investigations designed to find problems rather than assess compliance. This wasn't a routine inspection triggered by scheduling requirements, but a targeted audit designed to create difficulties for Thunder Ridge Ranch. You're welcome to inspect anything you'd like, Jake said calmly, but I'll need to see your identification and official authorization for this audit. Davidson's expression tightened slightly at Jake's request for proper documentation, suggesting he hadn't expected to encounter someone familiar with regulatory procedures. He produced his credentials along with official paperwork that appeared legitimate, though Sarah noticed several elements that seemed unusual for routine compliance inspections. "Mr. Reynolds, we understand you recently hired new personnel for record-keeping functions," one of the other inspectors said, consulting her own clipboard. "We'll need to interview this individual as part of our assessment of your documentation systems." The specific reference to Sarah's employment confirmed what she had already suspected. This audit was directly connected to Hayes' discovery of her location, timed to create maximum disruption during her first week at Thunder Ridge. The precision of their information suggested that Hayes had provided detailed intelligence about the ranch's recent changes. "Miss Mitchell is our records administrator," Jake replied. "She'll be happy to answer questions about our documentation systems, though I should mention that she's only been employed here for 3 days. Any historical compliance issues would predate her involvement." Sarah appreciated Jake's subtle protection, establishing her limited responsibility for historical problems while making it clear that Thunder Ridge would cooperate fully with legitimate inspection processes. But she also recognized that this investigation represented exactly the kind of harassment Hayes specialized in, using official channels to create pressure and expense for his targets. "We'll begin with a review of your livestock tracking records for the past 3 years, Davidson announced. "Please direct us to your record-keeping facilities." Jake led the inspection team toward the ranch office, now partially organized thanks to Sarah's work over the past few days. She had managed to sort the most critical documents and establish basic filing systems. But 3 years of accumulated chaos couldn't be completely resolved in 72 hours. As they approached the office, Sarah felt the familiar anxiety that accompanied being judged by incomplete work, the same feeling she had experienced when administrators observed her classroom before she had fully implemented new teaching strategies. But this time, the stakes extended beyond professional evaluation to potential legal and financial consequences for Jake and Thunder Ridge Ranch. "Miss Mitchell," Davidson addressed her directly as they entered the office, "please explain your qualifications for managing livestock documentation and regulatory compliance." The question was designed to establish her lack of specific agricultural experience, laying groundwork for characterizing any organizational problems as evidence of incompetent record-keeping. Sarah recognized the tactic from her teaching days, when hostile administrators would ask questions designed to highlight limitations rather than assess capabilities. "I have a master's degree in education with extensive experience managing complex documentation systems," she replied calmly. "While my background is in educational rather than agricultural records, the fundamental principles of organization, compliance tracking, and systematic documentation transfer across different industries." Davidson made notes on his clipboard, with obvious skepticism. "And how long have you been employed in agricultural record-keeping?" 3 days at Thunder Ridge Ranch," Sarah answered honestly. "But I should point out that Mr. Reynolds hired me specifically to organize and systematize records that had accumulated over several years. Any current compliance issues would reflect historical practices rather than recent management decisions. We'll determine the scope and timeline of any compliance issues," Davidson replied dismissively. "For now, we need to examine your current filing systems and documentation procedures." The next 2 hours proceeded with methodical inspection of every document Sarah had organized, every system she had attempted to implement, and every aspect of Thunder Ridge's record-keeping practices. The inspectors photographed file cabinets, copied documentation, and asked detailed questions about procedures that were still in development. Throughout the process, Jake remained present and supportive, answering questions about ranch operations, while subtly reinforcing that Sarah was addressing inherited problems rather than creating new ones. His calm professionalism under pressure impressed Sarah, who recognized the self-control required to remain courteous toward people who were obviously conducting harassment disguised as official inspection. Frank and Maria also endured questioning about ranch operations, employment practices, and recent changes in household staff. The inspectors seemed particularly interested in the timeline of Sarah's hiring, the circumstances surrounding her employment, and her living arrangements at the ranch. "Mr. Reynolds," one inspector asked during a break in the document review, "what prompted you to hire someone with no agricultural experience for such a critical position?" "Miss Mitchell has exactly the skills Thunder Ridge needed," Jake replied firmly. "Organizational expertise, attention to detail, and the ability to create functional systems from existing chaos. Her educational background is an asset, not a limitation. And you weren't concerned about her employment history, any background checks, or reference verification. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks as the inspector's questions moved toward her termination from Dusty Creek schools, but Jake's response cut off that line of inquiry with decisive authority. Miss Mitchell's qualifications speak for themselves, and her performance here has exceeded expectations. Thunder Ridge Ranch doesn't make hiring decisions based on gossip or unsubstantiated allegations. The inspection concluded around noon, with Davidson announcing that his team would need to review their findings before determining whether additional investigation was warranted. The language was bureaucratic code for, "We didn't find enough problems to justify immediate action, but we're keeping this file open for future harassment." After the inspectors departed, the Thunder Ridge household gathered in the kitchen to process what had just occurred. The morning's events had confirmed their suspicions about Hayes's reach and vindictiveness, while also demonstrating the ranch's ability to withstand official scrutiny when properly prepared. "Well," Frank said dryly, "that was about as routine as a rattlesnake in a baby's crib." Maria began preparing lunch with more energy than usual, her domestic efficiency channeling stress into productive activity. Those men were looking for trouble, not compliance problems. Did you see how disappointed they looked when they couldn't find major violations? "They'll be back," Jake predicted grimly. Hayes isn't the type to give up after one failed attempt. This was reconnaissance as much as harassment, figuring out our vulnerabilities for future attacks. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy coat. "Jake, I'm so sorry I brought this trouble to Thunder Ridge. If you want me to leave, I'll understand completely." "Sarah," Jake's voice carried firm authority that stopped her apology mid-sentence. "You didn't bring trouble here. You brought expertise that we desperately needed and integrity that Hayes obviously fears. If he's willing to abuse state regulatory processes to harass you, then you must represent a more serious threat to his interests than he's comfortable ignoring. But what if this escalates? What if he finds ways to damage the ranch's reputation or business relationships?" Frank leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who had reached an important decision. "Miss Sarah, let me tell you something about ranch country. We've got our own ways of dealing with bullies, and they don't involve running away or giving in to pressure." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of another vehicle approaching, but this time Jake's expression relaxed as he recognized the engine's sound. Through the window, Sarah saw a pickup truck that bore the distinctive markings of a neighboring ranch operation. "That's Bill Morrison from Circle M Ranch," Jake explained. "Bill's been our neighbor for 15 years, and he's got a nose for trouble that would make a bloodhound jealous." Bill Morrison emerged from his truck with the unhurried movements of someone who had observed the morning's official visitors and drawn his own conclusions about their purpose. He was perhaps 60 years old, with the kind of weathered dignity that came from decades of successful ranch management and community leadership. "Afternoon, Jake," Bill said, accepting a cup of coffee from Maria and settling into a kitchen chair with familiar ease. "Saw you had some state visitors this morning. Everything okay?" "Routine inspection," Jake replied with careful neutrality, though the timing was interesting. Bill nodded slowly, his experienced eyes taking in the tension that still lingered around the kitchen table. "Funny thing about routine inspections, they usually get scheduled through proper channels, and neighboring ranchers usually hear about them in advance. This morning's visit was the first I'd heard of any agricultural audits in the area." The implication hung in the air like morning mist, subtle but unmistakable. Bill Morrison had recognized that the inspection was targeted rather than routine, and his presence at Thunder Ridge suggested that the ranch community's informal communication network was already responding to the perceived threat. "Bill," Jake said carefully, "I should probably mention that the timing might be related to some political complications involving our new records administrator. Nothing that affects ranch operations, but it could explain why we're suddenly interesting to state bureaucrats." Bill's gaze shifted to Sarah with frank assessment, the kind of direct evaluation that ranch people use to measure character and reliability. She met his scrutiny without flinching, understanding that her response to his attention would influence his opinion about Thunder Ridge's judgment in hiring her. "Miss Mitchell, isn't it?" Bill said finally. "Heard you used to teach school." In Dusty Creek before some political nonsense cost you your position. That's correct, Mr. Morrison. I exposed corruption in the school system and discovered that integrity doesn't always protect you from retaliation. Integrity's rare enough these days that it's worth protecting when you find it, Bill replied approvingly. And anyone who makes politicians nervous is probably doing something right. His casual acceptance of her situation and implicit support for Jake's hiring decision carried weight that Sarah was only beginning to understand. In ranch country, reputation traveled through networks of relationship and mutual respect that operated independently of official channels. Bill Morrison's approval represented community validation that could prove more valuable than any regulatory compliance certificate. Jake, if you're expecting more official attention, the neighbors ought to know about it, Bill continued. We've got our own ways of keeping track of strangers asking questions or causing problems for people who don't deserve harassment. The conversation that followed revealed the depth of informal cooperation that connected ranch operations throughout the region. Shared resources, mutual assistance during emergencies, and collective resistance to outside pressure that threatened any individual member of the community. Sarah realized that Hayes's attack on Thunder Ridge was being interpreted as an assault on the entire ranching network, triggering protective responses that extended far beyond Jake's property boundaries. As Bill prepared to leave, he turned to Sarah with paternal kindness that reminded her of her own father's quiet wisdom. Miss Mitchell, you picked a good place to make your stand. Thunder Ridge Ranch has been part of this community for 4 generations, and Jake Reynolds has more friends than he probably realizes. Anyone who tries to run you off is going to discover that ranch people take care of their own. The afternoon brought additional visitors, each arriving with various pretexts, but clearly motivated by curiosity about the morning's inspection and solidarity with Thunder Ridge's response to outside pressure. Sarah found herself introduced to neighboring ranchers, local business owners, and community leaders who expressed support for Jake's hiring decisions and skepticism about sudden regulatory interest in well-established operations. By evening, the kitchen table had become an informal command center where Jake, Sarah, Frank, and Maria planned their response to future harassment while building networks of support that extended throughout the regional ranching community. The day that had begun with anxiety about Hayes's discovery of her location was ending with growing confidence that Thunder Ridge had allies Hayes couldn't intimidate and resources he couldn't control. As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she reflected on how dramatically her understanding of safety and support had evolved in just 24 hours. The morning's inspection had confirmed her fears about Hayes's vindictiveness and reach, but the community's response had revealed protective networks she hadn't known existed. Thunder Ridge Ranch wasn't just offering her employment and housing, but membership in a community that valued integrity and defended its own against outside threats. But even as she felt grateful for the unexpected solidarity, Sarah understood that the day's events represented only the opening moves in what promised to be a prolonged campaign. Hayes had tested Thunder Ridge's vulnerabilities and discovered that direct regulatory pressure would be insufficient to achieve his goals. His next moves would likely be more creative, more personal, and potentially more dangerous than bureaucratic harassment. She fell asleep planning defensive strategies and organizational priorities, her mind working through the kind of systematic preparation that had once helped her students master complex academic challenges. But this time, the stakes extended beyond grades and graduation to the future of relationships and community connections that had become more precious than she had realized possible. The October morning that changed everything began with an emergency that had nothing to do with Richard Hayes or his escalating campaign against Thunder Ridge Ranch. Sarah woke at dawn to the sound of frantic knocking on the ranch house door, followed by Jake's heavy footsteps rushing down the stairs. Through her bedroom window, she could see Tommy Chun standing on the front porch, his clothes disheveled and his face streaked with tears that caught the early sunlight. Sarah threw on her robe and hurried downstairs to find Tommy collapsed in one of the kitchen chairs, his thin shoulders shaking with exhaustion and fear. Jake stood nearby with a cup of coffee, his expression carrying the careful attention he gave to injured animals or damaged equipment, problems that required immediate assessment and gentle handling. "Tommy, what happened?" Sarah asked, kneeling beside her former student and noting the dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept in days. "My parents were arrested last night," Tommy said, his voice breaking on the words. "Immigration agents came to our apartment around midnight. They had warrants, official papers, everything looked legal. But Miss Mitchell, my parents have been legal residents for 12 years. They have green cards, work permits, they've been paying taxes and following every rule." Sarah felt ice forming in her stomach as she processed the implications of Tommy's story. Immigration raids targeting legal residents were unusual unless someone had provided false information to federal authorities, creating justification for investigation and detention. The timing, coming just weeks after Hayes had learned about her connection to Tommy, suggested coordination that went far beyond coincidence. "Where are your parents now?" Jake asked, his voice carrying the practical focus that preceded action rather than sympathy. "They're being held at the detention facility in Austin," Tommy replied. "I tried to call the immigration lawyer my uncle recommended, but he said the charges are serious. Someone reported that my father was working without proper authorization, and that my mother had lied on official documents. The lawyer said even if the charges are false, it could take months to resolve." Sarah's hands clenched into fists as the pattern became clear. Hayes had obviously discovered Tommy's connection to her and used federal immigration enforcement as a weapon against the boy's family. It was exactly the kind of indirect attack he specialized in, using legitimate authorities to cause maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability about his involvement. "Tommy, do you have somewhere safe to stay while this gets sorted out?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "My uncle in Dallas said I could come there, but I can't leave my parents. And if I miss school, I'll lose my chance at the scholarship to UT. Everything we've worked for, all the college applications and test scores, it doesn't matter if I can't graduate on time." Jake moved to the kitchen window, staring out at the ranch landscape with the kind of focused intensity that meant he was calculating options and consequences. When he turned back to face them, his expression carried the determination Sarah had learned to associate with his most important decisions. "Tommy, you're going to stay here at Thunder Ridge until your parents' situation is resolved," he said simply. "We've got plenty of room, and Sarah can help you keep up with your studies while we figure out how to fix this mess." "Mr. Reynolds, I can't ask you to take that kind of risk," Tommy protested. "If Hayes is behind this, helping me could make him target the ranch even more than he already has." "Son," Jake replied with quiet authority, "Hayes has already declared war on this ranch by going after Sarah. Adding you to our household doesn't increase our risk. It just gives us another reason to make sure we win this fight." Maria appeared in the kitchen doorway, having been awakened by the early morning commotion. She took one look at Tommy's tear-streaked face and moved into protective mode with the efficiency of someone who had been caring for displaced people her entire life. "Mijo, you look like you haven't eaten in days," she said, beginning breakfast preparations with increased energy. "We'll get some food in you, find you clean clothes, and then we'll figure out how to help your parents." As Tommy accepted Maria's maternal care, Sarah felt her anger crystallizing into something harder and more focused than the helpless rage she had carried since losing her teaching position. Hayes had escalated beyond harassment into destruction of innocent families, using federal authorities to tear apart legal immigrants who had committed no crimes beyond being connected to people he wanted to punish. "Jake, we need to contact that immigration lawyer Tommy mentioned," she said. "And we need to document everything about the timing of this arrest, the charges being made, and any evidence that suggests coordinated harassment." "Already planning on it," Jake replied. "But first, we need to make sure Tommy's safe and his immediate needs are taken care of. Then we can focus on fighting back." Frank arrived for breakfast to find an expanded household, but he adapted to Tommy's presence with the same practical acceptance he showed toward any ranch emergency. After hearing the boy's story, the ranch foreman's expression hardened with the kind of cold anger that suggested Hayes had finally pushed the wrong people too far. "This crosses a line," Frank said simply. "Going after a kid's family with false immigration charges, that's not just harassment anymore. That's the kind of vindictive cruelty that decent people can't ignore." "The question is, how do we prove Hayes was behind it?" Sarah asked. "Immigration raids look legitimate on paper, even when they're motivated by political retaliation." Tommy looked up from the breakfast Maria had placed in front of him, his young face showing a maturity that no 16-year-old should have to possess. "Miss Mitchell, there might be a way to prove Hayes was involved. My father received a phone call 2 days ago from someone claiming to be from the immigration office, asking questions about our family's employment status and documentation. He thought it was routine verification, but now I think it was someone gathering information for the false report." "Did your father recognize the voice?" Jake asked. "He said the caller knew details about our family that weren't in any public records. Things like my scholarship applications and which colleges I was considering. Information that could only have come from school files." Sarah felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. Hayes had access to student records through his position on the school board, information he could have used to build a false case against Tommy's parents. The phone call Tommy described sounded like intelligence gathering designed to make fraudulent immigration charges appear credible. "We need to contact the immigration lawyer immediately," she said. "And we need to find out if there are any records of that phone call, any way to trace who made the report against Tommy's parents." Jake was already reaching for his phone. "I'm calling Bill Morrison first. He's got connections with federal law enforcement through his work with cattle rustling investigations. If anyone can help us navigate immigration bureaucracy, it's Bill." The next several hours blurred together in a flurry of phone calls, legal consultations, and strategic planning that reminded Sarah of the most intense days of her teaching career, when multiple crises demanded simultaneous attention and careful coordination. Jake contacted every resource in his network, from neighboring ranchers with federal connections to attorneys who specialized in immigration cases. Bill Morrison arrived at Thunder Ridge within 2 hours, bringing with him a retired federal agent named Patricia Gonzalez who had handled immigration fraud cases for over 20 years. Patricia listened to Tommy's story with the kind of professional attention that suggested she had encountered similar situations before. The timing and specificity of the charges suggest someone provided detailed false information to immigration authorities, Patricia confirmed. "Legal residents don't get arrested on work authorization violations unless someone files convincing reports with supporting documentation. How do we prove the reports were false?" Sarah asked. "By demonstrating that the information couldn't have been obtained through legitimate investigation," Patricia replied. "If we can show that whoever made the report had access to confidential school records or other protected information, that establishes a pattern of harassment rather than legitimate law enforcement." Tommy's phone buzzed with an incoming call, and his face lit up when he saw the caller identification. "It's my parents," he said, answering immediately and switching to rapid Mandarin that reflected his relief at hearing their voices. After several minutes of intense conversation, Tommy ended the call with tears streaming down his face, but this time they carried hope rather than despair. "They're okay," he reported, scared and confused, but not hurt. "And they said the immigration lawyer was able to review their case files. The charges are completely fabricated, based on reports that claim my father was working at businesses that don't exist and that my mother used false documents that were actually issued legally 12 years ago." Patricia leaned forward with interest. "Fabricated charges are easier to disprove than legitimate disputes about documentation. If we can establish that the businesses mentioned in the report don't exist, that's evidence of fraud that could trigger an investigation into whoever filed the false claims." "How long will it take to get Tommy's parents released?" Jake asked. "If the charges are obviously false, possibly within a week," Patricia replied. "But only if we can demonstrate that this was harassment rather than legitimate law enforcement action. That means proving who made the false reports and why." Sarah felt determination crystallizing into a plan that drew on everything she had learned about systematic investigation during her teaching years. "We need to document every connection between Hayes and this immigration case. Phone records, meeting schedules, anyone who had access to Tommy's family information. We need to build a case that shows this was coordinated retaliation." "I can help with that," Tommy said quietly. "I know which teachers had access to my college application materials, and I remember some of the questions the caller asked my father. If Hayes was involved, there might be evidence in the school records." Jake's expression grew thoughtful as he considered the implications of Tommy's suggestion. Getting access to school records could be complicated, especially if Hayes controls who can examine district files. "Not necessarily," Sarah said, feeling pieces of a larger strategy beginning to form. The state investigation into Hayes' embezzlement is still technically active, even though local authorities haven't pursued it. If we can connect his retaliation against Tommy's family to his attempts to silence whistleblowers, that might trigger federal attention. Patricia nodded approvingly. Immigration fraud connected to suppression of corruption investigations would definitely interest federal prosecutors. That's the kind of systematic abuse of government resources that crosses multiple jurisdictions. The afternoon brought additional visitors to Thunder Ridge, as word of Tommy's situation spread through the ranch community's informal communication network. Neighboring families arrived with offers of support, legal assistance, and resources that reflected the deep-rooted values of mutual aid that characterized rural Texas communities. Sarah found herself amazed by the coordination and efficiency with which the ranching families mobilized to protect one teenager and his imprisoned parents. Within hours, they had assembled a legal team, documentation specialists, and federal contacts that rivaled the resources of major law firms. This is what community looks like, Jake explained as they watched another truck arrive carrying a family friend who happened to be a federal prosecutor. When someone attacks one of our own, especially someone as innocent as Tommy, we respond with everything we've got. But it was the arrival of Dr. Elena Vasquez, Tommy's former chemistry teacher, that provided the breakthrough they needed. Elena had driven from Dusty Creek carrying a manila folder that contained photocopies of documents she had salvaged from her classroom before resigning in protest over Hayes' retaliation against Sarah. I kept copies of everything related to Tommy's college applications, Elena explained. I knew Hayes was targeting students who had been connected to Sarah, and I wanted to protect evidence of their academic achievements. She spread the documents across Jake's kitchen table, revealing scholarship applications, recommendation letters, and academic transcripts that contained detailed information about Tommy's family background. But more importantly, the files showed margin notes and annotations in Hayes' distinctive handwriting, comments about Tommy's immigration status and family employment that had no legitimate educational purpose. This proves Hayes was collecting information about Tommy's family months before the immigration arrests, Sarah said, studying the annotated documents. There's no educational reason for him to be researching the boy's parents' work authorization status. Patricia examined the documents with professional excitement. This is exactly the kind of evidence we need to establish premeditation and harassment. Combined with the timing of the immigration arrests, this builds a compelling case for federal investigation. Tommy stared at the evidence of Hayes' surveillance with a mixture of anger and amazement. He was planning this for months, wasn't he? Gathering information, waiting for the right moment to destroy my family. That's exactly what he was doing, Sarah confirmed. And that's exactly what's going to get him into serious federal trouble. The late afternoon brought news that accelerated their timeline dramatically. Patricia received a call from her former colleagues at the Immigration Enforcement Office, informing her that Tommy's parents' case had attracted attention from the Inspector General's office due to irregularities in the initial reports. Someone high up in immigration enforcement recognized the pattern of false reporting and triggered an internal investigation. Patricia explained after ending her call. Tommy's parents will be released tomorrow morning pending review of the charges, and the Inspector General wants to interview anyone who has evidence about how those charges originated. Jake's expression carried satisfaction mixed with determination. Good. It's about time Hayes faced consequences for his abuse of federal resources. But we need to be prepared for escalation, Sarah warned. Hayes isn't going to accept federal investigation quietly. He's going to fight back with everything he's got. Her prediction proved accurate sooner than anyone anticipated. As the sun set over Thunder Ridge Ranch, illuminating the gathered vehicles of their community supporters, 3 black SUVs arrived at the main gate carrying federal agents who identified themselves as investigating potential threats against immigration enforcement officers. The lead agent, a stern woman named Agent Carter, explained that their office had received anonymous reports claiming that Thunder Ridge Ranch was harboring individuals who had made threats against federal immigration officials. The timing was obviously coordinated to disrupt the growing federal investigation into Hayes' role in Tommy's parents' arrests. This is harassment disguised as law enforcement, Patricia said bluntly after reviewing the agent's search warrant. Someone is using federal resources to intimidate witnesses and disrupt legitimate investigation. But Agent Carter's expression shifted when she recognized Patricia's credentials and learned about the immigration fraud case that had brought federal attention to Hayes' activities. Within an hour, what had begun as a hostile investigation transformed into a collaborative effort to document the pattern of abuse that connected multiple federal agencies. "We've been tracking suspicious immigration reports for the past 6 months," Agent Carter explained. "Someone has been filing false claims that waste federal resources and terrorize legal immigrants. If you have evidence connecting these reports to political retaliation, that's a federal crime we take very seriously." As darkness fell over Thunder Ridge Ranch, the kitchen had become a command center where federal agents, immigration attorneys, and ranch community members worked together to build a comprehensive case against Hayes' systematic abuse of government resources. Tommy sat at the center of it all, his young face showing amazement at the network of support that had materialized around his family's crisis. "Miss Mitchell," Tommy said during a quiet moment between interviews, "I never imagined that standing up to Hayes would lead to all this. Federal investigations, community support, people I've never met fighting for my family." Sarah looked around the crowded kitchen, noting Jake's quiet leadership, Maria's maternal care for everyone present, Frank's steady competence, and the ranching families who had abandoned their own evening routines to protect a teenager they barely knew. "Tommy, this is what happens when good people decide they won't tolerate bullying anymore," she replied. Hayes made the mistake of thinking he could destroy individual families without the community noticing or caring. He underestimated the power of people who believe in protecting each other. The evening's work culminated in Agent Carter placing a phone call to her supervisor, recommending immediate federal investigation into Hayes' abuse of multiple government systems for personal retaliation. The evidence they had assembled painted a picture of systematic corruption that extended far beyond simple school board embezzlement. "Mr. Hayes is going to have some very serious questions to answer," Agent Carter announced as she prepared to leave Thunder Ridge. Federal prosecutors don't appreciate having their resources used for personal vendettas, especially when it involves false imprisonment of legal immigrants. After the federal agents departed, the ranch community gradually dispersed to their own homes, leaving Jake, Sarah, Tommy, Maria, and Frank to process the day's dramatic developments. The kitchen felt quiet after hours of intense activity, but the silence carried anticipation rather than exhaustion. "Tommy, your parents will be released tomorrow morning," Jake said. "Patricia is driving to Austin to meet them and help with the paperwork. You can go with her if you want, or you can wait here for them to come to Thunder Ridge." "I think I'd like to wait here," Tommy replied after considering the options. "This place feels safe in a way I haven't experienced since my parents were arrested. Besides, Miss Mitchell promised to help me with my college application essays, and the deadlines are coming up fast." Sarah felt her heart swell with emotion at Tommy's trust and his determination to continue pursuing his educational goals despite the trauma his family had endured. It reminded her why she had chosen teaching in the first place, this opportunity to help young people navigate challenges while maintaining focus on their long-term dreams. 3 days later, Tommy's parents arrived at Thunder Ridge Ranch carrying flowers, homemade dumplings, and gratitude that transcended language barriers. Mr. and Mrs. Chun spoke limited English, but their tears of relief and repeated thanks needed no translation as they embraced their son and the people who had fought to reunite their family. The federal investigation into Hayes' activities proceeded with efficiency that surprised everyone familiar with government bureaucracy. Within 2 weeks, federal prosecutors had filed charges related to immigration fraud, abuse of federal resources, and conspiracy to suppress corruption investigations. Hayes' network of municipal connections proved worthless against federal jurisdiction and interstate crime allegations. Sarah received a phone call from Agent Carter on a crisp November morning, informing her that Hayes had agreed to a plea bargain that included resignation from all public positions, restitution for damaged parties, and cooperation with ongoing investigations into local government corruption. "He's finished," Agent Carter reported with satisfaction. "Federal charges, state ethics violations, and civil liability that will keep him in legal trouble for years. More importantly, He'll never again be in a position to retaliate against people who expose wrongdoing. The news reached Thunder Ridge just as Sarah was finishing her morning organization of the ranch office, a space that now functioned with the kind of systematic efficiency that made complex operations seem manageable. The transformation from chaos to order had become a metaphor for everything that had changed in her life since that desperate night when she had answered Jake's job advertisement. Jake found her in the office, standing among the perfectly organized files and computer systems that now tracked every aspect of Thunder Ridge's operations with professional precision. His expression carried the kind of quiet satisfaction that came from seeing important work completed successfully. "Agent Carter called," he said. "Hayes is finished. Federal prosecution, career destroyed. No more threat to you or anyone else." He was targeting. Sarah felt relief wash through her so completely that she had to sit down to process the magnitude of what his words meant. For the first time in nearly a year, she could plan for the future without constantly looking over her shoulder for new forms of retaliation and harassment. "It's really over?" she asked, needing confirmation that this victory was genuine and permanent. "It's really over," Jake confirmed. "Hayes's plea agreement includes provisions that prohibit any future contact with you, Tommy, or anyone else." He targeted. Federal prosecutors don't mess around with witness intimidation or continued harassment. Tommy appeared in the office doorway, having overheard their conversation while working on college applications at the kitchen table. His face showed the kind of relief that comes with the lifting of burdens too heavy for young shoulders to carry. "Miss Mitchell, does this mean my family is really safe? That we don't have to worry about Hayes causing more trouble?" "That's exactly what it means," Sarah replied. "Hayes can't hurt your family anymore, and he can't prevent you from pursuing every scholarship and college opportunity you've earned." The celebration that evening brought together the entire Thunder Ridge community, with neighboring families gathering to mark not just Hayes's defeat, but the strength of relationships forged through crisis. Sarah found herself surrounded by people who had become family through shared struggle and mutual support. As the evening wound down and guests began departing for their own ranches, Jake asked Sarah to join him on the front porch for a conversation that had been postponed too many times during the weeks of legal battles and federal investigations. "Sarah, I need to ask you something that's been on my mind since this whole situation started," he said, settling into the chair beside her with the comfortable ease that had developed between them. "When Hayes is completely finished with his legal troubles and there's no more danger to worry about, are you going to want to stay at Thunder Ridge?" The question carried weight that extended beyond employment concerns, touching on feelings and possibilities that had grown stronger throughout their shared challenges. Sarah realized that what had begun as desperate acceptance of shelter had evolved into something much deeper, connections that made Thunder Ridge feel like home in ways she hadn't experienced since childhood. "Jake, 3 months ago, I was sleeping in library corners and applying for jobs that might never materialize," she replied. "Tonight, I'm sitting on the porch of a ranch that feels more like home than anywhere I've lived since my parents died." My answer is yes. I want to stay at Thunder Ridge, not just because I need employment, but because this is where I belong. Jake's smile carried relief and joy that transformed his entire expression. "Good, because I can't imagine this place without you anymore. The ranch runs better, the office actually functions, and everything feels more alive with you here." "There's something else," Sarah continued, feeling courage that came from knowing their future was secure. "Jake, what I feel for you goes beyond gratitude or professional respect. Somewhere in the midst of organizing your chaos and fighting our enemies, I fell in love with a man who sees integrity as more important than convenience and community as more important than individual success." Jake reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Sarah, I fell in love with a woman who taught me that protecting what matters sometimes means fighting for it, and that the best partnerships are built on shared values, rather than shared convenience." Tommy's voice carried from the kitchen where he was apparently eavesdropping on their conversation. "Miss Mitchell, are you going to marry Mr. Reynolds and make this officially the happiest ending ever?" Sarah and Jake burst into laughter at Tommy's direct approach to romance, but the question he'd asked carried the weight of real possibility. They had built something together that extended beyond crisis response into genuine partnership, the kind of relationship that could weather any future challenges. I think, Jake said carefully. That's a conversation for another evening. When we've had time to process everything that's happened and make sure our feelings are based on more than shared danger and mutual respect. But it is a conversation we're going to have, Sarah asked, hope evident in her voice. It's definitely a conversation we're going to have, Jake confirmed. Probably sooner rather than later. 6 months later, on a spring morning when wildflowers carpeted the Texas hills surrounding Thunder Ridge Ranch, Sarah Mitchell became Sarah Reynolds in a ceremony that brought together the ranching community, Tommy and his parents, federal agents, who had become friends and colleagues from throughout the region who had supported their fight against corruption. The ranch office that had once been Jake's organizational nightmare now served as headquarters for a consulting business where Sarah helped other agricultural operations establish record-keeping systems that protected them from regulatory problems and business inefficiencies. Tommy had received full scholarships to 3 universities and chose UT Austin specifically because its proximity to Thunder Ridge would allow him to visit the family that had saved his parents and supported his dreams. As Sarah stood in the kitchen of her ranch house home, watching Jake teach Tommy advanced cattle management techniques while Maria prepared celebration dinner for their extended family, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from desperate homelessness to abundant belonging. The teaching position she had lost because of her integrity had led to work that utilized her skills more comprehensively than any classroom ever could. The harassment that had driven her from town had connected her with people whose values aligned with hers more completely than any community she had previously known. The man she had married combined strength with gentleness, leadership with humility, and love with respect in ways that made every day feel like the best kind of adventure. Jake found her in quiet contemplation and wrapped his arms around her. From behind, his chin resting on top of her head as they watched their chosen family gather around Maria's dinner table. "Any regrets about the path that brought you here?" he asked softly. Sarah leaned back against his solid warmth, feeling gratitude for every difficult choice and painful experience that had led her to this moment of perfect belonging. "Not a single one," she replied. "Every hardship was worth it to find this life, this family, this love that's built on everything I value most." Outside, the Texas sunset painted Thunder Ridge Ranch in golden light that promised clear skies and favorable weather for whatever seeds would be planted in the seasons ahead. Inside, the sound of laughter and conversation filled rooms that had been too quiet for too long, evidence that homes, like hearts, were meant to be shared with people who understood that love is most powerful when it's expressed through daily acts of protection, support, and unwavering commitment to each other's dreams. The homeless teacher had indeed been kept in the giant Cowboy's Hearts records, filed permanently under the most important category of all, family, forever and always. The winter storm that arrived in late December brought with it the kind of harsh beauty that transformed Thunder Ridge Ranch into a crystalline wonderland, but also tested every system and relationship that had been built throughout the year. Sarah stood at the kitchen window watching snow accumulate against the barn doors, her breath fogging the glass as she calculated the logistics of maintaining cattle operations in conditions that would challenge even experienced ranchers. Behind her, Jake moved with the quiet efficiency that characterized his approach to weather emergencies, checking supplies and coordinating with Frank about livestock protection strategies. His calm competence in the face of potentially dangerous conditions reminded Sarah of why she had fallen in love with a man whose strength showed itself not in dramatic gestures, but in steady reliability when circumstances demanded absolute dependability. "The Weather Service is predicting 18 inches by morning," Jake reported, hanging up the phone after consulting with neighboring ranchers about storm preparations. "We've got enough feed stored to last 2 weeks, and the emergency generator is fueled and ready if we lose power." Sarah felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that accompanied her first winter at Thunder Ridge, the awareness that ranch life involved challenges she was still learning to navigate. But alongside the nervousness was excitement about participating in operations that connected human survival to natural cycles in ways her former urban existence had never required. "What can I do to help?" she asked, turning from the window to face Jake with the same determination she had once brought to preparing students for difficult examinations. "Actually, There's something important we need to discuss before this storm hits, Jake replied, his expression carrying the kind of serious attention that preceded significant conversations. Sarah, I've been thinking about our future here at Thunder Ridge, about the direction we want our lives to take. The tone of his voice suggested this was the conversation they had been approaching for months, the discussion about permanent commitment that had been delayed by legal battles, federal investigations, and the daily demands of establishing their relationship on solid foundations. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she recognized the significance of timing that would bring this moment during their first major storm together. I've been thinking about the same things, she admitted, settling into the chair across from him at the kitchen table where they had shared so many meals and made so many plans. Jake, this year has shown me that love isn't just about feelings. It's about choosing to build something together that's stronger than either person could create alone. Jake reached across the table to take her hands, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. Sarah, when Emma died, I thought the part of my life that involved partnership and shared dreams was over. I figured I'd spend whatever years I had left just maintaining what my family had built, keeping the ranch running without really living. Snow continued to fall outside the window, creating a sense of isolation that made their conversation feel removed from the outside world, protected by weather and distance from anything that might interrupt this moment of complete honesty. Then you arrived here carrying nothing but determination and integrity, and everything changed, Jake continued. Not just because you organized my chaos or helped fight haze, but because you reminded me that building a future is more important than just preserving the past. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she listened to words that articulated feelings she had struggled to express about her own transformation during their months together. Jake, I came here thinking I needed rescue, shelter from people who wanted to destroy me for telling the truth. But what I found was partnership with someone who values the same things I do, who sees protecting others as more important than protecting himself. Sarah Michelle Mitchell, Jake said formally, releasing her hands long enough to retrieve a small velvet box from his shirt pocket. Will you marry me and help me build the next chapter of Thunder Ridge Ranch? Will you be my partner in everything that matters and my companion through whatever storms life brings our way? The ring inside the box was simple but beautiful, a solitaire diamond set in white gold that caught the kitchen light like captured starlight. But more than the ring itself, Sarah was moved by the question it represented, the invitation to commit to a future that would be built on everything they had learned about each other through crisis and calm. Yes, she said simply, extending her left hand to receive the ring that would mark their official engagement. Yes to marriage. Yes to partnership. Yes to building something together that honors the past while embracing whatever possibilities the future holds. As Jake slipped the ring on her finger, the fit was perfect, as if Emma Reynolds had somehow guided his choice towards something that would suit Sarah's hand and lifestyle. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of them. This sense that their love carried blessing from those who had loved before them and would honor the sacrifices that had made their happiness possible. The engagement celebration was delayed by the immediate demands of storm preparation, but Sarah found that sharing the work of securing Thunder Ridge against winter weather felt more romantic than any formal announcement could have been. Side by side, they moved through the ranch buildings, checking feed supplies, ensuring water systems wouldn't freeze, and making sure every animal had adequate shelter from the approaching blizzard. Tommy, home from his first semester at UT4 winter break, threw himself into storm preparations with the enthusiasm of someone who had found his calling in agricultural work. His parents had relocated from Dusty Creek to a small apartment in the nearest town, where Mr. Chin had found employment at a feed store and Mrs. Chun worked part-time at the local library, positions that utilized their skills while keeping them close to the ranch family that had become central to their lives. Miss Mitchell, Mrs. Reynolds-to-be, Tommy said with a grin as he helped Jake secure equipment in the main barn. This is the best wedding announcement ever. Getting engaged during a blizzard at a cattle ranch. It's like something from a movie about people who really understand what matters. Sarah laughed at his enthusiasm while appreciating the truth beneath his joking observation. Their engagement was happening amid real work that would affect real lives, surrounded by people who had chosen each other based on shared values rather than convenience or social expectations. It was exactly the kind of beginning she wanted, for a marriage that would be built on substance rather than sentiment. Maria appeared in the barn doorway carrying thermoses of hot coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose instincts about people had been proven correct. Mija, I've been waiting for this announcement since your second day here. That man has been carrying that ring around for 3 months, checking it every morning like he was waiting for the perfect moment. 3 months? Sarah asked, turning to Jake with surprise and amusement. You've been planning this proposal for 3 months? Jake's cheeks reddened slightly, but his expression carried the kind of happiness that made him look younger and more carefree than she had ever seen him. I knew I wanted to marry you by October, but I wanted to wait until all the legal troubles were resolved and we could start planning our future without looking over our shoulders for new crises. Frank emerged from the feed room carrying satisfaction that suggested all emergency preparations were complete. When he noticed Sarah's engagement ring, his weathered face broke into the kind of genuine smile that transformed his usually serious expression. About time, he said simply. This ranch has needed a proper family for too long, and you two have been dancing around the obvious since Hayes first showed up causing trouble. The storm hit Thunder Ridge with the full force the weather service had predicted, transforming the ranch into an isolated world where survival depended entirely on preparation, cooperation, and the kind of mutual dependence that revealed character under pressure. Sarah discovered that blizzards brought their own strange beauty, the way snow sculpted familiar landscapes into new forms, and the way shared challenges created intimacy that ordinary circumstances couldn't match. Power lines went down around midnight, but the emergency generator kicked in seamlessly, maintaining heat and light in the main house, while backup systems protected the barn facilities. Sarah and Jake took turns checking on cattle throughout the night, trudging through knee-deep snow to ensure no animals were in distress and no equipment had failed under the weight of accumulated precipitation. This is what ranch marriage looks like, Jake told her during one of their midnight checks, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around his face. Long hours, shared responsibility, and trust that your partner will be there when things get difficult. I can't think of anything I'd rather be doing or anyone I'd rather be doing it with, Sarah replied, meaning every word despite the cold that seemed to penetrate even the heaviest winter clothing. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by pristine snow that sparkled under brilliant sunshine. The cattle had weathered the blizzard successfully, the ranch infrastructure had functioned perfectly, and Sarah felt the deep satisfaction that came from successfully navigating her first major ranch emergency as part of the team rather than as someone who needed protection. The engagement announcement brought visitors throughout the following week, neighbors braving difficult road conditions to offer congratulations and share in the joy of two people who had found love through shared trials. Each visit reinforced Sarah's understanding of how completely she had been accepted into the ranching community, not as Jake's girlfriend or employee, but as an individual whose contributions were valued and whose happiness mattered to people who had become extended family. Dr. Elena Vasquez made the drive from town specifically to congratulate Sarah and share news that brought their story full circle. The new superintendent is cleaning house at Dusty Creek Schools, Elena reported. 3 administrators have been fired for their roles in covering up Hayes' corruption, and the school board has formally apologized to you for the way you were treated. Sarah felt complicated emotions at this news, satisfaction that justice was being served mixed with sadness for opportunities that had been lost and relationships that had been damaged by institutional failure. Are they offering me my teaching position back? They want to meet with you about returning. But Sarah, I think you found something better than what you lost, Elena replied, gesturing toward the ranch that surrounded them and the man who stood beside Sarah with protective pride. You've built a life that uses all your skills while connecting you to people who share your values. Teaching was what you did, but this is who you are. The wisdom in Elena's observation resonated deeply with Sarah's own evolving understanding of identity and purpose. Her months at Thunder Ridge had revealed capabilities she hadn't known she possessed, satisfaction in work that extended beyond classroom walls, and relationships based on mutual respect rather than professional hierarchy. I think you're right, Sarah replied, I'll always be grateful for my teaching years and the students who taught me as much as I taught them. But my future is here at Thunder Ridge with Jake and the family we're building together. Wedding planning proved to be an adventure that reflected both Sarah's organizational skills and the community's enthusiasm for celebrating love that had emerged from struggle. Rather than a traditional ceremony, they decided on a spring celebration that would coincide with the ranch's annual gathering for branding and vaccination, combining their personal commitment with the communal work that defined ranch life. Tommy volunteered to coordinate invitations while maintaining his academic schedule, approaching the task with the same systematic attention he brought to his engineering studies. Miss Mitchell, I want this to be perfect because you and Mr. Reynolds saved my family and showed me what real integrity looks like in action. The months between engagement and wedding passed in a blur of planning, daily ranch operations, and the kind of deepening relationship that came from sharing responsibility for something larger than individual happiness. Sarah established her consulting business with ranchers throughout the region, seeking her expertise in record-keeping and regulatory compliance, work that utilized her teaching skills while contributing to the agricultural community's success. Jake expanded Thunder Ridge's operations to include a mentorship program for young people interested in agricultural careers, partnerships with local schools that brought students to the ranch for hands-on learning experiences. The program honored Emma's memory while creating opportunities for teenagers like Tommy to discover careers they might never have considered. Their wedding day arrived with perfect spring weather, wildflowers blooming across the hills, and cattle grazing peacefully in pastures that had recovered from winter's dormancy. Guests included federal agents who had become friends, neighboring ranchers who had supported them through crisis, and students from both Sarah's former classroom and Jake's new mentorship program. Tommy served as ring bearer with pride that reflected his own transformation from frightened refugee to confident college student preparing for a career in agricultural engineering. His parents sat in the front row wearing traditional Chinese clothing that honored their heritage while celebrating their integration into the Texas ranching community that had become their permanent home. The ceremony took place on the front porch of the ranch house, where Sarah had first felt the stirrings of belonging, surrounded by people who had chosen each other based on shared values rather than accident of birth or geography. Rather than traditional wedding vows, Sarah and Jake spoke from their hearts about partnership, protection, and the commitment to build something together that would honor both their individual strengths and their collective dreams. Jake Reynolds, Sarah said, holding his hands while looking into eyes that reflected years of shared challenges and unlimited future possibilities. I promise to be your partner in every season, your supporter in every challenge, and your companion in building a legacy that makes the world better for everyone who comes after us. Sarah Mitchell, Jake replied, his voice carrying emotion that made his usual reserve seem like preparation for this moment of complete vulnerability. I promise to protect what we build together, to value your strength as much as I offer mine, and to love you with the same constancy that the land loves the sky, forever and without condition. Frank served as officiant, his authority derived not from religious ordination, but from community recognition of his wisdom and integrity. When he pronounced them husband and wife, the celebration that followed included traditional ranch music, Maria's legendary cooking, and dancing under stars that seemed unusually bright over Thunder Ridge Ranch. As their wedding night settled into quiet intimacy, Sarah and Jake sat on their front porch watching the same stars that had witnessed every important moment of their relationship, from her desperate arrival through all the challenges they had navigated together to this evening of perfect joy. Any regrets about the path that brought you here? Jake asked, echoing a question that had become their private ritual during significant moments. Only that it took me so long to find my way to Thunder Ridge and to you, Sarah replied, leaning into the warmth and strength that had become her definition of safety. But maybe we both needed to become the people we are before we could build what we have together. Jake's arm tightened around her shoulders as he considered her words. Emma used to say that everything happens in its own time. That trying to force timing usually means you're not ready for what you think you want. She was wise, Sarah said, thinking about the woman whose presence still blessed Thunder Ridge through the love she had built and the man she had shaped. I hope she would approve of what we're creating here. She would love you. Jake said with certainty. Not because you replaced her, but because you bring your own gifts to this place while honoring what came before. That's the kind of grace she believed in. The following months established rhythms that felt both new and eternal, the daily patterns of ranch life that connected their individual purposes to something larger and more enduring than personal happiness. Sarah's consulting business grew to include ranchers across 3 states, her reputation for excellence attracting clients who valued systematic approaches to complex challenges. Jake's mentorship program expanded to include partnerships with universities and agricultural extension services, creating pathways for young people to discover careers that combine traditional ranching with modern technology and sustainable practices. Tommy became the program's first success story, completing his engineering degree while maintaining connections to Thunder Ridge that would influence his career choices for years to come. The ranch itself flourished under their combined management, with Sarah's organizational systems enabling efficiency that increased profitability, while Jake's cattle expertise maintained the quality reputation that had sustained Thunder Ridge for 4 generations. But beyond financial success, the ranch became a gathering place for community events, educational programs, and celebrations that strengthened the entire region's social fabric. 1 year after their wedding, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. With their first child, news that brought joy complicated by awareness that their happiness was built on the foundation of Emma's sacrifice and loss. But as the pregnancy progressed and their child grew within Sarah's body, the past and future seemed to blend into harmony rather than conflict. This baby will grow up knowing that love comes in many forms, Sarah told Jake as they discussed their hopes and fears about parenthood. The love that created this child, the love that Emma gave to this place, the love that Tommy and his parents share, the love that connects all of us to something bigger than individual concerns. Their daughter was born on a spring morning, when wildflowers painted the hills in colors that seemed designed specifically to welcome new life into the world. Elizabeth Sarah Reynolds arrived with strong lungs, grasping hands, and eyes that seemed to focus on faces with unusual attention for such a young infant. As Sarah held her daughter for the first time, feeling the weight and warmth of the child, who represented the future of Thunder Ridge Ranch, she understood completely why people chose to build families and communities that would outlast individual lifetimes. This tiny girl would grow up surrounded by people who valued integrity, hard work, and mutual support, lessons that would shape her character in ways that money or social status never could. Jake's face showed wonder and protective love as he studied his daughter's features, seeing in her tiny face the continuation of family legacy that he had thought might end with his generation. She's going to grow up knowing that her mother is a hero who stood up to corruption and her father would do anything to protect the people he loves. Tommy, now graduated and working as an agricultural engineer while maintaining his connection to Thunder Ridge, served as the baby's honorary uncle with enthusiasm that reflected his own transformation from frightened teenager to confident young man. His parents had become permanent fixtures in their extended family, Mr. Chun helping with ranch maintenance while Mrs. Chun provided childcare with the devotion of grandparents. As Elizabeth grew from infant to toddler, Thunder Ridge Ranch evolved into the kind of place Sarah had dreamed of creating when she first chose teaching as her profession. A place where learning happened through experience, where challenges were met with community support, and where every individual's contributions were valued as part of something larger than personal success. The ranch's educational programs attracted visitors from around the country, educators and agricultural specialists who wanted to understand how traditional ranching could be combined with modern learning techniques to create opportunities for young people who might otherwise struggle to find their place in rapidly changing economies. Sarah found herself speaking at conferences and writing articles about the integration of educational principles with agricultural practices, sharing insights that grew from her unique background in both fields. But the recognition and professional success mattered less than the daily satisfaction of building something meaningful with people she loved. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Sarah and Jake stood in the same spot where they had exchanged vows, now watching their 3-year-old daughter chase chickens while Tommy's younger sister, visiting from college, helped Maria prepare celebration dinner. The ranch bustled with the activity of multiple generations working together toward shared goals. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't seen that job advertisement? Sarah asked, thinking about the chain of coincidences and choices that had brought them to this moment of complete contentment. I think you would have found your way here eventually. Jake replied with the confidence of someone who believed in destiny without depending on it. Good people who share the same values usually find each other, even when the path isn't obvious. Elizabeth ran toward them with the fearless enthusiasm of a child who had never known anything but safety and unconditional love, her small arms reaching for parents who represented everything she understood about security and happiness. As Sarah scooped up her daughter and felt Jake's arms around them both, she realized that the homeless teacher's journey had led not just to employment or marriage, but to the creation of legacy that would influence generations. The giant cowboy had indeed kept her in his heart's records, filed under the most permanent category of all, family, love, and the promise of tomorrow written in the eyes of children who would carry their values forward into whatever future awaited beyond the horizon of Thunder Ridge Ranch. The story that had begun with desperation and fear had transformed into one of hope and abundance, proving that sometimes the longest journeys lead to the most valuable destinations, and that love built on shared struggle creates foundations strong enough to support whatever dreams are brave enough to take root and grow. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.